We are on Daf Peiches in the Perika Isha, and we're up to Tanur Rabbana. So if you look at the Tzuras Hadaf, you'll see that there are the skinny lines and the wide lines. So we are on the first of the wide lines, so it's very easy to find. Okay. Now, in order to appreciate the Gemara's question called Maichna Isha, let's just review the brisa that leads up to this question. The brisa tells us that there are three categories of individuals that are on the table here for this issue of determining where they will eat the carbon. The first category is Bino Ubito Aktanim, and that we said the authority and the decision where these young children would be eaten is totally, exclusively in the hands of the father. And then we have a category called Avdo V'Shifchaso Haknanim, and that I would combine that into one category, meaning those two, the members of his household, the Ktanim, the young children, and his Avodim Knanim. In all those cases, the head of the household, the master and the father, he will decide exclusively where they will eat the Korban Pesach. They have no say in the matter. He can decide against their will. That's category number one. Category number two would be Bino Ubito Hagdol, his children who are past bar mitzvah age, or Avdo V'Shivchaso Ivrim. We're talking about his servants who are Jewish. Like, for example, you have a Jew who never stole something, he can't pay back. So when we locate the thief and we know from whom he victimized and he stole from, he becomes sold as an eved. But he's a Jew. And in this case, we have in the Brisa, Midaitam. They are mature, past bar mitzvah, they have their own independence, and they will decide whether or not they're happy with the decision of the head of house as to where they will eat the korban. And I'll get back to that in a minute, because that's going to be our sugya for today, exactly what we need to hear from them. Then we have the third category, which is Ishto. Now, with regard to Ishto, it says the following. It says that Shachtu bi'atzma v'shachat rabban aleim yotze v'shal rabban yisrael atzma. If it's a case of an eved, a shivcha knani, and the eved or the shivcha went ahead and they participated in a certain korban, and the master had designated them for a different korban, they cannot eat from the korban that they chose. They have to eat from the korban that the master chose, as we said before. All the authority is vested in him. And then it says chutz min ha'isha, apparently singling out an isha. And it says sheyicholo limchos. Now wait a second. You're telling me that the husband, when he goes ahead and he designates a korban pesach for his wife, needs the approval of his wife, and she cannot be coerced and forced to accept his korban pesach. She can stand up and protest, veto it. So the Gemara asks, this is where we want to start today, Maishna Isha. Wait a second. You separated here in the Brisa between the following two categories. The category of Avdo v'shivchaso agedolim and the category of an Isha. I'm talking about an Eved Ivri. Why do you make that distinction? Why do you say chutz min Isha? You're telling me that the Isha has her own independent status and she tells her husband, Kol hakavod, thank you very much, but no thank you. I don't want your carbon, I got my own carbon or whatever. Why do you single out an Isha? Why is her status as an independent agent with the right to veto different than that of Avdo v'shivchaso ha'ivrim? And for that matter, let's talk about Banov ubito agdolim. His children are mature, they're past bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah. There are independent agents. Why do you say chutz min Isha? Amar Rava, Isha v'chol d'damila. The word Isha in this brisa should be interpreted as a koteret, as a category, rather than as an individual. And therefore, that word Isha includes not only a wife, it includes children who are past bar mitzvah and avdo and shivchaso ha'ivrim. In all the cases that we mentioned, the individual is an independent agent and will decide for himself or herself which carbon they will be part of. Fine. But the Gemara is still not happy. Ha-gufa kasha. The brisa is difficult in and of itself. Amrit, you tell me in the brisa, chutz min Isha, and now we're willing to say that Isha is a typology of an entire category. Fine. But what are you telling me? Sheyechola limchos. Are you telling me that she has veto power? That's all she has is veto power? Does she not, as an independent agent, have to approve that karma for herself? Taima, Dimachi, the reason why the carbon is undermined is because she vetoed it, she made a protest. Hello, Machi, are you telling me that if she didn't make a protest, Nafka b'shal baila, then she will be yotze the mitzvah Korban Pesach with that Korban Pesach that was designated on her behalf by her husband? Haktani Reisha, go back to the Reisha of the same brisa. And it says over there, V'lo yedei ishto ela midatan. The language of the brisa indicates that the husband cannot go ahead and designate a Korban Pesach on her behalf, and then we'll see if she vetoes it. He can only do so midatan if he was commissioned by his wife. She has to give him approval from the get-go. My dear husband, please go ahead and designate a Korban Pesach on my behalf. So what is it going to be? Are we going to go with the Seifa? And the last part of the Bryce indicates that she has rights to veto. But as far as, let's say she's not around to veto it, then the carbon is hers simply because of the designation of her husband. Or no, go back to the Reisha, and the Reisha of the Bryce says, Elamidaiton, that the husband does not have the power vested in him to designate a carbon on her behalf, unless he was commissioned to do so. Elamidaiton habstama lo nafka. She cannot fulfill her mitzvah of Korban Pesach by virtue of the fact that he has his Korban Pesach and he invited her and registered her on his Korban Pesach. That's not enough. You need midaita. Stama will not do it. Stama means she's not available for questioning. So the Gemara says, "My, what does it mean in the ratio when it says Elami Daiton?" You misunderstood the ratio. Lav the Amri in, not that she has to explicitly enunciate an approval and say, yes, please, go ahead with this. Ella, but what it means to be Daiton Bistama. Stama means that she didn't say anything to the opposite. She didn't express any objection. Lafuki hecha di amarlo. And the carbon will not be kosher on her behalf. In other words, she can't be participating in the carbon in a case which she says lo. But she doesn't have to say yes. Lav di amri in. Let's go over it again. Don't interpret the word midaiton means that she has to say yes. From the time of the shechita, she had to express her approval. No. Midaiton means to the exclusion of the opposite, which means when she made a veto and a protest. Very difficult stretch, to push this into the word midaiton. I mean, I have to tell you, for the little I know of the Talmud, the word midaiton means you have to have approval. But here it can't mean that, because the Sefer the Brisa says that that she has power of veto. So we have to reinterpret the midaiton, not in a positive approval that she has to express, but rather midaiton means lafuke, to exclude the opposite, which is a macha. So the Gemara is not happy with this. Let's read the Brisa one more time. For her quote, Kulam sheshachtu v'shachat Rabban aleim yotzin b'shel Rabban. The Brisa indicates that in all cases, with the exception of Isha, but in all cases, yotzin b'shel Rabban. That's fine, because as we said before, as long as we didn't have a veto, that's fine. Dibistama, that all these cases, like for example, Beno Bito Agdolim, or the case of an Eved Ivri, he can go ahead and designate it on their behalf for Korban Pesach, and they're not around to express their approval because it says Yotzim B'Shel Rama, meaning they can fulfill their mitzvah by virtue and as a result of the designation of their master in the case of an Eved Ivri. And then immediately afterwards, it says in the Brisa, Kani Chutz Min Ha'isha. She doesn't fit into that category. That's what the word chutz means, of Yotzim B'Shel Rama, meaning b'stom. Stom is not enough. Stom is enough in other cases, but not in the case of the Isha, because it says Chutz Min Ha'isha. So when it says Yechola Limchos, what it really means is that it can't be Midas Baila. He does not have the authority to set up a Korban Pesach on her behalf, unless she commissioned him to do so. But Stoma, it's not valid. Omar Rava, again, Rava comes back with, let's push it in. And he says, Kevach shachatu ein lecha michui gadol mizeh. What this Bryce is talking about is a case where she or the Damila, all those who fit into that category, like Panapita Gedolim and the Eved Ivri, she went ahead and she participated in a carbon of her own decision. She commissioned whoever it is, whichever Kohen, let's say, to shech the carbon on her behalf. And in that case, the Brisa is telling us, chutz min ha'isha, that the husband has no authority whatsoever. Again, when we say Isha, we mean Isha v'dedomila. Why? Because if she brought her own Korban Pesach, she doesn't have to make a mecha. She made the most profound mecha that you could imagine. Sometimes actions speak louder than words. She doesn't have to explicitly say, I object. She goes ahead and brings her own carbon, commissions the kohanim. Here's my little shepsela, my little lamb. Go ahead and be makriv of it. That itself, says Rava, is a mecha. Mecha doesn't have to be a formal declaration. I object. I am not allowing and recognizing my husband's authority to set a carbon on my behalf. This is a mecha. But she doesn't need to approve her husband's designation if she didn't do her own, if she didn't make her own carbon, bring her own carbon. Stum is enough. So basically, it turns out that we have three scenarios. Scenario number one is where the husband designates a carbon on her behalf, and it's a stomach situation. She says nothing, neither nay nor yea. In such a case, the Gemara's conclusion is it's valid. She can eat from his carbon Pesach. She doesn't have to designate or approve or commission him to bring the carbon on her behalf. Now we get to scenario number two. She says, I don't want it. It wasn't a case of stava where nothing happened and it went by, but rather she made an explicit pronouncement, a declaration. I don't recognize this carbon. It's not valid. Scenario number three, on the one hand, she said nothing, but on the other hand, as we said, action, she went ahead and brought her own carbon. And Rava says, Ein lecha mecha gedol mizu, and that's considered a mecha. But again, the husband does have the right, in the absence of a mecha, or in the absence of her bringing another, to designate the carbon on her behalf. And now we get to the next case in the Mishnah, an eved that's owned by two partners. And the Mishnah says that if let's say each one of the partners, each one of the adonim went ahead and designated the carbon on behalf of his eved, meaning his part of the eved, then it's not valid. So the Gemara asks, Rami later of Anna Sabler of Nachman Tanan, we have a Mishnah, Eved shel shnei shnutvim lo yochel mishem shneim. The Eved can't eat from both or either of the karbanos, we should say, because there's a tug of war between the two masters as to which carbon the Eved is part of. But that it goes against the Brisa. The Brisa discussed the case of Eved shel shutvim. Ratza mizel ochel, ratza mizel ochel. The Brisa says in very clear words that the ball is in the court of the Eved. He will decide which of the two karbanos he prefers. And that's in direct clash with what the Mishnah says, that lo yochel mishel shneim. Malaser of Nachman gives a little rub here to Eina Saba. He calls him by his first name, and he says to Amrila, Pasya Uchma. It's literally a black utensil, meaning it's like filthy, because when you use a utensil, it gets black from the soot or from the smoke or whatever it is. So he's calling it a black utensil, meaning it's repulsive. However, now he calms it down a little bit. He says, Minayu minach tistayim shmaitata. I don't understand the sugya, and you don't understand the sugya. There's an explicit contradiction between the Mishnah and the Brisa, but together, in a joint effort, we will unravel the mystery of this Brisa, of the stira, of the contradiction between the Mishnah and the Brisa. So on one level, he sort of repelled him, rejected him, but on the other level, he's saying, you know what? You brought to my attention a very intriguing question, and the answer, I think, is very straightforward. And what is that? Masnisen b'kapti adadi u'braisa delo kapti adadi. There are two types of partnership relationships. One is good and one is bad. So if you have a relationship between two partners, which is called kapti adadi, In other words, each one of the shutfim is vying for his ownership rights in the Eved. He doesn't want to give up any of his rights. So there really is a friction, and and there are loggerheads one with the other. In such a case, if one of them went ahead, let's say sequentially, and he shechted the Korban Pesach on behalf of the Eved, it's not going to be valid. Why? Because the other partner doesn't want to give up his rights, his possession rights over this Eved, and he wants to be the one to determine who will, from which carbon he will eat. And as a result, the Mishnah says that this Eved is neither here nor there. He cannot benefit from either one of these two Korbanos Pesach, because each master, each owner is makpid on the other one. However, the Brisa is addressing a very friendly kind of partnership, user-friendly. The lokapti adadi, they're not makpid one on the other. Let's say, for example, there are 6 work days in the week. So you took it on Sunday, and I should get the Eved on Monday. But you needed a job done on Monday, so you took it for 2 days consecutively. So I'm not going to be makpid. You know what? You'll make it up for me. You'll give me another day later on. I'll get Tuesday and Wednesday, whatever it is. There's an amicable relationship between the two partners. In such a case, once the first Adon went ahead and he designated a carbon on behalf of the Eved, that's Chal. Whereas in the Mishnah, when they're Makbid Adadi, that means that we always assume that the other Adon is not going to give up his rights to the Eved in any phenomenon, in any manifestation whatsoever, even when it comes to the religious act of eating with the Korban Pesach. You went ahead and you shechted the Korban Pesach on behalf of this Eved? Why are you cutting me out of the picture? Am I chop liver? I have the same rights as you do. My partnership is just as good as yours. Then we get to the case of Chetzia Eved, Chetzia Ben Chod. And the Mishnah says, in this case, first of all, let's just make sure we all know what the case is. You have 2 owners, like we had before, partners over an Eved. And one of the 2 owners relinquishes his ownership. I'm out of here. Again, how he effectuates that, we have to know. It's called a get shichur, but he removes his ownership. What's left with is, because once an Eved gets a shichur, he now becomes a full-fledged Jew. But the only problem is that although one partner relinquished his ownership, the other partner did not relinquish his. So this man is a schizophrenic. He wears 2 hats. He's a Ben Chorin, which has the status of a regular Yisrael, and he's also an Eved. Again, this is not a case of a suffix. We know exactly what happened over here. It's a kind of legal suffix or a tension within the legal system. And now there's one Adon who owns half the Eved. He went ahead and he designated a Karman, a Pesach, on behalf of this Eved. Well, it should be operative, but that's only as far as half the Eved. The other half is an independent agent of Yisrael Gomur. No one could be makriv a carbon on his behalf. And the Mishnah says that in this case, he will not be allowed to eat from the carbon of the Rav, of the Adon, who owns half of the Eved. So the Gemara asks the following kash. Mishal Rabo hu de lo yochal. If you read the Mishnah meticulously, it says that he cannot eat from the Pesach of his Rav. Is that telling you where is he? Is he out in the cold? Does he have a shaykhus to the Korban Pesach? The answer is if he goes ahead and he designates a Korban Pesach for his own behalf, that's valid, even though half of him is owned by a master. For Tanya, we have a brayso lo yochal lo mishalo lo mishal rabu, that the man is out in the cold. He doesn't have the option neither of enjoying the benefit of the korban that was designated by his half owner, nor from the korban that he designated as his half free person. How do we reconcile these two, the Mishnah with the Bryce? Lo kash. And Mishnah Rishon of a Khan, Mishnah Achron. Gemara says that historically there was a conflict, a debate between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai, and in this rare case, Beis Hillel at some later point in time conceded that Beit Shammai are right. The original machlokes was revolved around the very strange, what word am I looking for? It's a word at the tip of my tongue. I'll use the word anomaly, a legal anomaly. It's a contradiction in the law itself. Can this man marry a Jewish woman? I can even go further. Is this man obligated to marry a Jewish woman? We have a mitzvah called Piri V'Rivi. The problem is that an Eved cannot marry a Jewish girl. He can marry a Shivcha Knanis. But the Chatzi Ben Chorin Shabo, half of him is a full-fledged Jew, and he has to marry a Jewish girl. He cannot marry a Shivcha. So Beit Shammai says that in order to facilitate this Eved, who's Chatzi Ben Chorin's ability to marry, because right now he can't marry anyone, we will compel his half owner to relinquish his ownership over the Eved. And the poskim say he'll be reimbursed for that. And the Eved takes upon himself a shtar chov. He's going to have to give him the value. But as far as his ownership over the Eved, Beit Shammai say we could force him to give a get, shichrur, and relinquish his ownership on the half of the Eved. Then he becomes a full-fledged Jew and he'll marry a Jewish girl, and Beit Shammai will be the Masechet Kiddush. And Beis Hillel say no. You cannot force him to do so, despite the very legal difficulty in the life of this Chatzi Eved, Chatzi Ben Chorin, but you can't force a person to give up his ownership over the Eved, although he only owns half the Eved. That's called the Mishnah Rishon. Later, and we have to understand why, Beis Hillel pulled out. And they said, you know what? Beit Shammai are right. We are going to force him to divorce, or I shouldn't say divorce, but it's called a get, to give a get shichrur to the Eved, like Beit Shammai said. The nafkamina, above and beyond the issue of forcing the shichrur, is as far as the Korban Pesach is concerned. Interesting. When you have a situation which at this point in time is impossible, there's an impasse, that the Rav, the Adon, designated a Korban Pesach on behalf of the Eved who's half an Eved. So we're stuck with an impasse because the half of Ben Chorin does not have the ability to be part of the Korban Pesach of his Rav. He has to set up his own Korban Pesach. So here we have the right to say, let's look at the future or the potential. What's going to happen down the line? Disnan, Misha chetzio eved chetzio ben chorin oved es rabo yom echad ves atzmo yom echad divrei Beis Hillel. Beis Hillel say we have a working relationship here that's going to go on ad infinitum, and every other day he works for his adon, his rav, and every other day he works for himself. And Beit Shammai omrim, Beit Shammai say, and here we turn to Daf Peches on the base, takantem es rabo. This is very nice for the Rav that he'll get Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday. But as atzma lo tikanta, you did nothing, Beis Hillel, on behalf of the Eved himself. Don't you feel any element of compassion for the Eved? Lisa shivchei yochol, he can't marry a shivcha shekvar chetzi ben chorin. And there's a lav d'oraisa called kadeshus, for Yisrael to marry a shivcha. Lisa bas chorin ain't yochel, can't marry a Jewish girl because adayin chetzio Eved. It's also a lav of kadeshus. Yibatel? You want to tell me that this fellow has to, for the rest of his life, he has to remain single? And the Jewish law will not allow him to get married to anyone? God wants man to propagate. Shenemar Paskin Yeshaya, lo sobra, lo sheves yitzor. Lo so, it wasn't created for tohu. Tohu means desolation, for what's called shmama in Hebrew, but rather sheves yitzor. God created it to be populated. Ella says Beit Shammai, mipnei tikun ha'olam kofinis rabbo v'yoso seben chorin, will beat the living daylights out of his adon until he finally agrees to deliver a get shikhr to the Eved. So now the Eved becomes a full-fledged Yisrael. Again, he'll be reimbursed for this. Kosei shtar shikhr. Oh no, this is what the Eved has to write. Kosei shtar chov al chatzi dom. And then the bottom line is v'chazur Beis Hillel lahoros kibeit Shammai. Beis Hillel eventually conceded and rescinded their original objection, their original position, and now they're on board with Beis Shammai, and we will kofanis Rabba will force the Rav to give a divorce. Okay, we went a little over time, but if you have one more minute, so how does this sugya explain and reconcile the contradiction between the Mishnah and the Brisa? The Mishnah says, Mishal Rabo hu delo yochal, avol mishal atzmo yochal. And the Brisa said, Lo yochal lo mishal shalo lo mishal Rab. The Brisa is addressing the original position of Beis Hillel, and this man is in a very strange situation. He's a chatzi eved, chatzi ben chorin. And either way, his korban pesach is not going to be valid. He's stuck between a rock and a high place. He's suspended in midair. His chatzi eved shabo will not allow him to organize his own karma, and his chatzi ben chorin shalo will not allow for his the Rav's designation to be relevant to him. He has no korban pesach. Get it? And of course, Don is going to ask me about Pesach Sheni, and we'll get to that in Hashem in the next Mishnah. However, our Mishnah says, Mishal Rabo, hu delo yochal, Mishal atzmo yochal. Imagine you have a chatzi eved chatzi ben chorin, and he's perfectly, legitimately authorized to set up his own korban pesach. But wait a second, he's got an adon, he's got a rav, who's insisting that he owns the Eved. And I'm going to determine which korban pesach I'll eat it from. How can he undermine my possession? The answer is, this is the Mishnah Achrona. This is after Beis Hillel swung around and accepted the principle of Beit Shammai Kofanis Rabbo. And Kofanis Rabbo means, let's look at the potential. It may take a day, a week, a month until we can finally beat the living daylights out of the Rav if he refuses and he's recalcitrant in delivering the get shechur, but ultimately it's going to happen because Beis Din is going to force him and coerce him to remove his ownership over the Eved. At the end of this legal procedure, that's what's going to happen. We are guaranteed that this Eved will become a full-fledged Ben Chorin, and therefore already now, even before the Adon has delivered his Get Shichur and clinched the state of the person as a full-fledged Ben Chorin, he can go ahead and designate the Korban Pesach on his own. And that's a valid minui on the Korban Pesach. Okay, then Rabbi Osai, this is where we'll stop. We have a little bit more here of Iyun, to remove some of the layers of the sugya and get down to some deeper elements of the sugya, but that the Lineder will do on a different occasion. Okay, then?
What if he doesn't designate? What if the Eved doesn't designate for a korban? What he can't get kares. He's only a half a year.
As far as I know, he will get kares because he's chayiv in the korban pesach. But this depends on a different question that Don has been pushing me on, which again is coming up later on. What's the status of an isha as far as korban pesach? Does she have an absolute chiyuv, or it's a little bit closer to what's called a rishus? We'll have to discuss that. Whatever we decide about the isha, then we'll know what the Eved. Because the Eved has the same status as the isha.
Isn't it strange that an Eved should eat a korban pesach when the korban pesach is you'd see a migula from after the gula, the shichrur?
Well, in this case, it's very exciting because he's going to set up his own korban pesach because we know, and we're going to force the Adon to free him. So he's really experiencing Yetzias Mitzrayim.
So what about the case where they're both? He's either owned by only one.
Yeah, right. That's the case that we're dealing with in our Mishnah. The Mishnah gives total authority over to the Adon, and the Adon is now saying to the Eved, you know what? You're also part of. If I have one pillow to sleep on, I'm going to have to give it to you to sleep on. I can't sleep on that pillow. So you're also a shtickle ben chorin, and I'm going to invite you to be my partner in the eating of the korban pesach, and we're going to celebrate the fact that you are a Jew, even though you're an Eved Knani, you're Jewish, and you're part of the korban pesach. So and we're going to emphasize that element of the relationship. I mean, take for example. We learned a Mishnah today, not in this class, but in another class about Tevi. Tevi was the Eved of Rabbi Gamliel.
Yeah, sure.
And, Rabbi Gamliel relied on Tevi for everything, to such an extent that when the korban pesach had to be brought, and there were issues about whether you're allowed to roast the korban pesach on a grill as opposed to a spit where the lamb is suspended and there's only air. Anyway, to make a long story short, Rabbi Gamliel appointed Tevi, and he said, you know what? You go ahead and find a grill that would be okay. And the Gemara has a different kind of a grill where the korban pesach was not sitting directly on the grill, so it wasn't getting heated up by the metal. Anyway, without going into the nitty-gritty details of the sugya, which is part of the Daf Yomi Shir, the point is, and we see this all over Shas. The Gemara says that they needed an Eved as the 10th for a minyan, and Rebbe freed his Eved. That's why out there in the Veld they have a misnomer about the word Eved. Eved is a very bad word. It has bad connotations. But in the Gemara, it's not so. The Eved had Mila, and he had Gerus, he had a Tvila. The Eved had to be Tovel in a mikvah, an Eved Kanani. And he was chayiv in mitzvahs ke'isha. Okay, there's certain things that he's excluded from. But nevertheless, he has, I would say he has more freedom than slavery. Okay. If the civil war was fought for the avodim of Klal Yisrael, the Eved Kanani, there would be no need for the Confederates to recede from the government. They were treated royally. An Eved Kanani was treated royally. Like I said before, there's one bed to sleep in. You got to give it to your Eved. Okay, then Rabbi Osai, I'm going to have to run now to Mincha. So I'll wish everyone a great day.
Take care.
Let me just add at the end of the shir a ha'ara of Tosfos. The Gemara is telling us in the following structure that before Beis Hillel pulled out and conceded, the situation of this Eved as a Chatzi Eved Chatzi Ben Chorin is personal, is permanent. It's not permanent in the case of Beis Hillel, the Mishnah Achrona, where he accepts Kofen Oso of Beit Shammai. And here we have a concept called biyado. Biyado means that it's already given, it's possible to be Meshachrer the Eved because we're accepting the final position of Beis Hillel. And therefore, as we medayik it from the Mishnah, he, the Chatzi Eved Chatzi Ben Chorin, already at this stage in his life, even before he gets to Shichur, he can go out and appoint himself to a Korban Pesach. Tosfos makes a very important point. Let's talk about the Brisa and the period of time when Beit Shammai and Beis Hillel were arguing, and Beis Hillel insisted that we cannot force him, and therefore was saying that he still has a Chatzi Eved Shabo, and therefore that Chatzi Eved Shabo, and we can't get rid of that. There's no way we can coerce the Adon to give up his rights to the Chatzi Eved. That blocks him from going out and appointing himself on his own to a Korban Pesach. Tosfos makes the following point. The situation of the Chatzi Eved Chatzi Ben Chorin should not be worse than the situation of two Shutfim. Even in the case of two Shutfim, if one of the two went ahead and assigned the Eved to a Korban Pesach, it might be valid. And we said it all depends on whether Kapti Adadi or low Kapti Adadi. Here too, we're going to have to ask the question, the Adon, the Rav who owns half the Eved, is he makpid? He doesn't want the other half, so to speak. In this case, it's the Eved himself, to benefit in any way independent of him. And he's going to always claim, wait a minute, I'm a balabas over here. I own half of you. But given the fact that if he's not makpid, and his relationship with the Chatzi Eved, Chatzi Ben Chorin, is that the Chatzi Ben Chorin has freedom and he could act on his own, then the Chatzi Eved, Chatzi Ben Chorin, even before Beis Hillel conceded and backed out, would be able to organize his own Korban Pesach because it would be no different than a case of two owners who are not makpid one on the other. Even in the situation of the Mishnah Rishona, Dafka ba'ofen sherabo makpid, the Rav is very makpid. Commotion is nisbar li'el b'gemara li'inyan din shel eved shel shnei shutfin. The kevan sherabo makpid, the Rav is makpid. He doesn't want the other chelek of the avdus to benefit on its own independent self. Azai ena yochel mishalatzma. But in a case where he's not makpid, then even in a Chatzi Eved Chatzi Ben Chorin on a permanent basis, meaning during the period of Beis Hillel in the Mishnah Rishona, there would be a possibility in lo makpid for the Eved to organize his own Korban Pesach. Okay, then, so that's what I wanted to add to today's discussion. All right, then.